Terry Fontenot is tied up and back in the trunk, and I'm taking over today as the Falcons' new general manager and giving you 5 free agents that I'm starting our defensive rebuild with.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And, of course, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app. So I am kidnapping Terry Fontenot for the second time this week. We are locking Ryan Pace in the bathroom again. He'll be fine. And I'm taking over as a general manager and giving you my 5, which it ultimately comes down to free agents along the front 7 that I would like to sign. And, before I put the duct tape on Terry, he told me, Aaron, no matter what, you got to strut. But no, he seriously told me, you got to prioritize the front. That's what we're going to do here. And that's what we're going to do on today's episode. We're going to talk about 5 front 7 players that I'm going to add to this defense to get the ball rolling, to elevate this defense to competent levels, which we have not seen in Atlanta for several years. And, if I'm being completely honest with you, looking at the secondary, if I had to do this today, the only secondary player I'd sign is Jesse Bates, the Cincinnati Bengals safety. Do whatever it takes to get him here. I did consider a couple of corners to sign, but ultimately I was like, I don't know. I don't love the fit. And so therefore I can wait till the draft. But next week we'll do another free agent Friday at the end of the week, and that will be an opportunity to do any revisions to this defensive thing that we're doing today, or the offensive players that I thought the Falcons should add earlier this week. But at least today we get to take a deeper look at several of these front 7 players, just because we don't have to deal with all the other stuff. And I'll let you guys know up front, this group of players may lack the sex appeal that I think some of you guys are desiring, particularly in free agency. And that's mostly due to my mission is less about, hey, we're going to magically fix this defense in free agency. It's about, let's raise the floor of this defense, right? And it's also about, let's check enough boxes so that we don't feel pigeonholed when we go into the draft. Because I'm at a point in my process where I feel confident saying, I'm probably knee deep in this draft class, right? And by the time we get to April, I would like to be in it up to my chin. But, we're not there yet. And I want to have the flexibility with some of these signings to go out there and get, the best player available. And it's not just simply, we'll draft whatever we draft. I have a tentative plan, again, assuming that I'll be able to kidnap Terry for the 3rd time later this offseason when draft time. And also, maybe we'll lock Ryan Pace in the janitor's closet this time. And, my tentative plan is probably to go cornerback, pass rusher, and offensive tackle, in some order with the first 3 picks. What order they come in will depend on sort of what my final evaluations are on these players, how the draft board is going to go, because we'll have a better idea, come April 25th, a few days before the draft, than we do today on March 2nd when I'm recording this. So it is let's check as many boxes, let's solve as many problems now. But in order to do that, we need to get as many good players as we possibly can. This team is not 1 or 2 players away from being, a contender. They're probably a dozen players away, if we're being completely honest. And so you want to, I won't say go quantity over quality, but you do want to check those boxes. Now, particularly in the interior D line and the linebacker, there are a lot of big name guys, and certainly I would not be upset if the Falcons were to sign some of the bigger, sexier splash players at those positions. But for now, my only splash, at least in terms of my initial plan, is probably Jesse Bates on that side of the ball on defense. And I feel like we'll still accomplish the mission of infusing a lot of talent on this defensive side of the ball. Because I look back at last year's defense, and there were 17 players along the Falcons front seven that played snaps last year. 6 of those guys were undrafted free agents, so roughly a third of the guys that the Falcons were trotting out on defense up front for most of last season were guys that were essentially, no offense to the Anthony Rushes and the Matt Dickersons of the world, but were essentially guys that you get off the street, right? And then you had like 4 more guys that were taken in round 5 or later. And so you only really had 5 guys that the Falcons were suiting up last year on the front 7 that were taken in the first 3 rounds. And obviously where you're drafted isn't the end all be all to, your overall talent level, right? Obviously Grady Jarrett being a 5th round pick, and he was arguably the most talented player on the Falcons defense last year. But it is one of those things where, like, when you look at those 5, players taken in the first 3 rounds, 3 of those guys were rookies. And so it was basically Rashaan Evans and Lorenzo Carter were, the high-end talents on the defense last year. And both of those guys are good athletes, but I would not call them high-end talents. And with the 5 guys I'm signing, 2 of those guys are former first-round picks. One was a very early second-round pick. Another was a 4th-round pick, and there is one late-round pick in the mix there. But overall, if I can accomplish my goals, not only in free agency, even later in the draft, realistically, like, I would like to see a situation where the only late round guys that the Falcons are playing along their front 7 this season are basically Grady Jarrett and Taquan Graham, the 2 guys that have risen above, being quote unquote late round picks in that regard. So we'll get into who I have the Falcons signing up front, and sort of the biggest name of that group is going to be a player that we've talked about a bunch over the last couple of weeks since the Ryan Nielsen hiring. And that is, of course, Marcus Davenport. And we'll talk about some other former Saints that will join him here in Atlanta as we continue today's episode. But everybody this time of year wants to eat a little bit healthier. And if you want to eat healthy and not have to compromise on taste, then Built Bar, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, is the thing for you. And the thing that makes Built Bar so good is they're covered in 100% real chocolate, but they not only taste great, they are healthy too. Only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, but a whopping 17 grams of protein. And if you head over to the website at built.com right now, you can order the limited time flavor of cookie dough chunk. But more importantly, if you head on over to your local Walmart or Sam's Club, you can also find Built Bars. So head to Walmart, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a 4-bar box of cookies and cream or double chocolate. Or if you're at Sam's, run in and grab a 13-bar box of peanut butter brownie and coconut almond. You guys will thank me later. So as I mentioned earlier this week when we did the offensive players, basically my strategy was, look, we know this regime, I'm going to borrow a page from Terry and Ryan and try to keep this thing grounded as possible. And, with the fact that this regime likes players that they have experience for, as I said, with the offensive guys, if there's a player that that this coaching staff has connections to that can check the box that I'm looking for, I don't feel the need to go outside of that and, try to have a couple of these guys that, I'm suggesting the Falcons sign actually be guys that they realistically could sign. And that starts with several former Saints. And up front, I have the Falcons signing 4 players, 3 of whom used to play for the Saints and Ryan Nielsen at one point. That's Marcus Davenport, Sheldon Rankins, and Mario Edwards Jr. And the 4th player is a non-Saint, and Andrew Billings. And those are going to be the 4 guys that I'm going to add to the Falcons front 4 alongside guys like Arnold Ebiketie, Grady Jarrett, and Taquan Graham. And hopefully we'll still have an opportunity to potentially add not only interior help, but also edge help in the draft as well. D'Angelo Malone is potentially going to probably play a little bit more of a stand-up linebacker role, maybe a Sam linebacker. We'll see what happens with guys like Adeola Ogundeji and Abdullah Anderson and Timmy Horn and Jalen Dalton and some of those guys. But basically, my goal is to basically make all of those guys that I just mentioned pretty expendable. Not D'Angelo Malone, but guys that we could cut those guys in training camp and you feel like you're no worse for wear. But let's talk starting with Marcus Davenport, kind of the signature guy. We've mentioned him a bunch. And Davenport's going to be an interesting free agent candidate because he's probably not going to get a long-term contract because of the durability issues that he's dealt with every year that he's been in New Orleans. He'll probably wind up signing a prove-it deal with some team, something that we discussed with Brad Spielberger of PFF last week. But I think because of that, you're going to get a highly motivated player that's going to fit the scheme. We know he can be productive in the scheme. He just hasn't put up the ridiculous sack production that I think the Saints were certainly hoping that he would do when they traded a future number 1 pick to get him. And we all scoffed at that move because it was paying a lot for a secondary pass rusher. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Marcus Davenport is some first-round bust and not a good player just because the Saints, as they are wont to do, tend to overpay with these trade-ups for certain players. And I think the thing that Atlanta can give Davenport that New Orleans was not able to do that may allow him to put his best foot forward as a pass rusher is that he can line up on both sides of the defensive line here in Atlanta that he wasn't really able to do in New Orleans due to the presence of Cam Jordan, right? That you look at the numbers and 7 out of every 8 of Marcus Davenport's pass rushing snaps when he was a Saint came on the right side of the defensive line, meaning that he was rushing against the opposing left tackle. And while the dichotomy between left tackles and right tackles in today's NFL is not as polarizing as it used to be, 10, 20 years ago, still the vast majority of teams still have their best left tackle, their best pass protector at left tackle versus right tackle. And so in those situations where the Saints would play a team like that, Cam Jordan more often than not was going to get the better matchup. And here in Atlanta, with him and Arnold Ebiketie presumably being the 2 main edge rushers for the Falcons, you can flip-flop those guys and get them the more favorable matchup. And I think that's going to be something that could benefit Davenport. To me, it's probably not a coincidence. I won't say it isn't a coincidence, but it's probably not a coincidence that the 1 year that Marcus Davenport had his most sacks, which was the 9 sacks he had in 2021, that was also the year that he had the most snaps rushing from the left side of the defense, so going up against the right tackle, right? I don't think that's a coincidence. So when it comes to what we're going to pay Marcus Davenport, we're going to basically borrow from PFF and get him that 1 year, $12 million prove-it deal, similar to the types of deals that Jadeveon Clowney, a similar player, high-end run defender, quality pass rusher, but may not necessarily be an elite pass rusher, but also has those durability concerns. That's something that Clowney has continually signed over and over again these last couple of years, and that may be in the cards for a player like Davenport. And we'll see, if he can finally put it all together, stay healthy, and have the sort of breakout performance here in Atlanta that he was unable to do in New Orleans. But I do think him and Arnold Ebiketie are going to form a really solid tandem. And Davenport, while his career numbers suggest that he's probably going to be something in the range of like a 6 to 8 sack guy, I do think he has the capability of breaking 10 sacks, especially if the rest of the pass rush is elevated moving forward. So let's talk about the sort of next guy that's going to help the pass rush in particular is Sheldon Rankins. And while Rankins is not an elite pass rusher, he's certainly a quality pass rusher that's been solid for the Jets the last couple of years, was solid with the Saints for several years. And I think the great thing about Sheldon Rankins, even though you could probably find, a better sort of tag team partner with Grady Jarrett on the interior on pass rushing downs, I think Rankins is a guy that is good enough to be a starter for you, but also you're not going to have to feel like, oh, well, we already, like, for example, if you went out and signed someone like Javon Hargrave, right? Like the money that you're going to spend on Javon Hargrave, let's say like 17, 18 million, right, is going to preclude you from going out there and getting another D tackle, going back to the point I made where, I still want to be flexible enough in the draft to be able to get a D tackle. And if I sign Sheldon Rankins for what I feel like is probably a fair market deal, PFF projects his contract to be a 2-year, $12 million deal, so $6 million a year, which is a slight increase from the deal he signed 2 years ago with the Jets for 2 years, $11 million. Like that's a good enough price for a low end starter. But also, if you find an upgrade in the next year or two, you're not going to feel bad about, well, we paid Sheldon Rankins all this money and we can't go and get that upgrade because he's making too much money. Like that's going to be the case with Javon Hargrave. Although, again, it's very debatable if you're going to find someone better than Javon Hargrave at any point in next year or two. But that's kind of the idea. Like you feel fine with if Sheldon Rankins is your third best D tackle, like you're not paying him a ridiculous amount of money and he's comfortable in that role. That's basically what he's been for the Jets. Or you probably argue he's the second best D tackle, right? It's Quinnen Williams and then who else? I'm sure the Jets fans are yelling at their phones. But yeah, I think Sheldon Rankins will be a solid addition. Probably, a 3 to 5 sack guy, probably can comfortably get you, 30-ish pressures in a starting role each and every year. And part of this, guys, is not because, and it goes back to a conversation we had last week when we were talking about Daron Payne and the idea of, it's not about having the 1 or 2 alphas in your pass rush, although no one's going to complain if you have, 1 or 2 alphas in your pass rush, but it is about like getting a large number of players. Like when you look at the best pass rush the Falcons have had over the last, 10, 15 years, it was the 2017. And it wasn't because they had some dominant guy that you could always rely on getting pressure each and every time. It was because they were like 6 and 7 guys deep, right? They had Dontari Poe and Adrian Claiborne and Grady Jarrett and Tack McKinley and Vic Beasley and Brooks Reed and Derek Shelby, right? It was not about, hey, this one guy's going to go in there and take over a game. It's about, we have like 6 guys that can get pressure on the quarterback, and on any given snap, one of those 6 guys is likely to win, right? And they take their turns. And there were games where Brooks Reed was the dominant guy. There were games where Beasley was. There were games where Tack made the plays and Claiborne. And it just alternated week to week. And that's kind of what I'm building. I think that's a realistic goal that I think the Falcons can accomplish this offseason with some of these signings. So again, I apologize if some of these moves don't have quite the sex appeal that some of you guys are seeking here, but there's a method to that madness. And continuing the conversation, let's talk about Mario Edwards, right? And Mario Edwards is a versatile player that can play, pretty much any spot up front, but he's primarily going to play D end for the Falcons, right? He's going to potentially be the guy on those early rundowns across from Marcus Davenport, where we may not necessarily be 100% sold on Arnold Ebiketie to be a full 3-down player, given, some concerns about his size there. And Mario Edwards, when you look at his best years as a pass rusher, his most productive years from a pressure standpoint were in 2015, his rookie year with the Raiders, and in 2022, this past year with the Titans. And notably, those were the 2 years where he spent the majority, or at least the highest percentage of his snaps playing as an edge rusher. And it really worked in Tennessee this year, where Tennessee liked to play with these lighter boxes. And they had Mario Edwards and DeMarcus Walker, these 280-pound defensive ends playing edge for them, so that those guys could really help them stack the run. And that's basically what Ryan Nielsen is going to bring to Atlanta as a defensive coordinator standpoint. I think Mario Edwards could be really good, but he also is very capable of, if you need him to play inside, rush the quarterback. The last time we probably talked about Mario Edwards on this podcast was back in 2020 when we played the Bears and the Falcons gave Matt Hennessy a couple of snaps there at left guard, and Mario Edwards, I think it was 5 snaps that Hennessy played in that game, and there was 3 snaps in a row where Mario Edwards beat him every single rep, right? And then we're like, oh, I don't know about Matt Hennessy at guard at this point in time. And so, now we bring Mario Edwards, and he's been kind of a journeyman type of guy, but very versatile player, can play wherever you need him to play. But, for the time being, he's going to be primarily probably a rundown DN for this Falcon team, and was very good this past year with the Titans in that role. And, he's not in PFF's top 100 free agent ranking, so we don't have a contract projection for him as of today's recording, but I'm guesstimating he'll sign like a 2-year, $5 million deal, because that's basically the same deal he signed with the Saints back in 2019 to basically play the role that I'm going to be asking him to play this year, which is more as a D end in that sort of heavy front. So that's what I'm envisioning for Mario Edwards. And the last guy up front that I'm going to be adding is Andrew Billings. And Billings is interesting because I remember for the website I used to work for, Pro Football Central, and I used to do a podcast named Falcons Central Radio with them. But back in 2020, the person who, the founder of Pro Football Central, Brian Harrington, did an interview with Andrew Billings. Shout out to Brian. And I was like, I walked away from listening to that interview very impressed with Andrew Billings, and he seemed like he was young and hungry. He, after 4 years in Cincinnati, was sort of poised to break out, had slimmed down, signed a contract with the Browns, like a 1-year, $3.5 million deal with the Browns, and looked like he was on the way up. And then he opted out that season after COVID hit. And I think it kind of derailed the momentum that he seemed to have at that point. And it felt like this past year with the Raiders, he was starting to get that back. And so I feel like we're getting that sort of that young, hungry Andrew Billings back at this point in time. And I imagine you can probably get him on a similar deal that he signed with the Browns, like a 1-year, $3.5 million type of deal. And ultimately, Davenport, Rankins, and Edwards were all ex-Saints. And I was like, initially going into this process, I was like, I'll probably just wind up bringing Shy Tuttle to be this sort of nose tackle. And that's what Andrew Billings is going to be, a one technique, and coming off a very good year with the Raiders. But, I was probably going to bring Shy Tuttle, but then I was like, I can't bring 4 ex-Saints. I don't want, I don't want Grady Jarrett and Taquan Graham to be completely outnumbered by former Saints in that locker room. So I had to bring in a non-ex-Saint. And Tuttle, while I'm a fan of his game, this adding this nose tackle, this one tech nose tackle, is probably the easiest spot to fill, and especially in this free agent class with guys like Billings, with Greg Gaines and Poona Ford and several other types of players that can come in and sort of provide the same sort of value that a guy like Shy Tuttle does. So we'll sort of see if the Falcons follow this blueprint. But overall, I'm adding 4 players for a combined total of about $24 million a year. And it goes back to a conversation we had last week about Daron Payne. And it's the idea of like, why pay one guy $20 million when I can get 3 or 4 guys at that same price, right? And that's kind of my thought process here. And, I kind of ran the numbers and looked at, what you could sort of project guys like Billings, Rankins, Edwards, and Davenport to have this year if they were to essentially replace, like if Billings replace all of Abdullah Anderson snaps, Rankins replace all of Taquan Graham's, Edwards, Ogundeji's snaps, and Davenport, Lorenzo Carter snaps. And those 4 guys, Anderson, Graham, Ogundeji, and Carter, combined for 62 pressures for the Falcons this past year. And basically, if these 4 guys that I have replacing them just have their average type of seasons with that type of snap count, you'll get 100 pressures instead of 62. So that's a decent increase, about 40 pressures. And then if all of those guys hit career highs, you're talking about, say, 120 pressures combined between those 4 guys. So let's split the difference and say that you're adding about 50 pressures to the unit, with $24 million. And then you sort of contrast that with Daron Payne and what he projected could have done had he not been franchise tagged by the Commanders this week. But, hypothetically, if you had signed Daron Payne and let's say you gave him all of not only Taquan Graham snaps, but also Abdullah Anderson snaps, even if he had his career high in terms of pressure rate, that's still only 40 pressures that Daron Payne is going to do with that type of workload. So theoretically, in my humble opinion, like signing Daron Payne, you're only going to add 30 or so pressures for $20 million. Meanwhile, I'm adding probably 50 pressures for about $24 million. So I think my way is getting a lot better bang for your buck. And it's very similar to the strategy that we've talked about in the past with what the Bengals did in 2021, where the previous year they were dead last in the NFL with 17 sacks in 2020. And then they moved to 12th in 2021 with 42 sacks, and they did it by going out there primarily via free agency, signing players like Trey Hendrickson and Larry Ogunjobi. They traded for BJ Hill, and DJ Reader was a player that they signed the previous year, but he got hurt, and so he was healthy. And so those four guys added about 169 pressures in addition to a whole bunch of sacks to that Bengals lineup. In 2021. And while, this foursome that I have may not add that type of production, I'm also counting that these four guys are going to help, elevate Grady Jarrett, elevate Arnold Ebiketie in the jump that he makes as well. So I feel like I'm in a position, I wouldn't necessarily project 42 sacks for this unit heading into 2023, but I certainly think we'll be a lot closer to 42 than we were to what were we, 21 this year, whatever that number was. So that's my hope with this group. And, I think Davenport can kind of be your Trey Hendrickson. Again, Hendrickson was definitely coming off a much better year when he signed with the Bengals than what Davenport is coming off of. But, there is no sort of 13 sack guy available at edge in this free agent class. So Davenport's probably the closest one. BJ Hill, by the way, was coming off 2 consecutive 1-sack seasons with the New York Giants before having 5.5 in his first year in Cincinnati. So I'm sure Bengals fans thought that maybe his trade acquisition was unsexy, similar to a Sheldon Rankins, and Larry Ogunjobi was coming off a 2.5-sack season in his final year in Cleveland before that jumping to 7 sacks in 2021. So again, that group probably lacked a lot of sex appeal to a lot of people back in 2021, and it came definitely through for the Bengals, and I'm hoping that this group is going to come through for the Falcons. But we will leave the D-line aside and wrap up today's episode by talking about which linebacker I'm going to have the Falcons bring into the building. And I had to go through a number of different options, but ultimately I settled on former Saints Kaden Elliss as a linebacker, and I'll basically take you through my thought process of why Kaden Elliss was the guy for the Falcons at linebacker as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen, and always check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast for your second listen. Of course, it's free and available on whatever podcast platform that you want, including on YouTube. So let's talk about the linebacker position. And, I'm already operating under the mindset that Troy Anderson is going to be one of my starting linebackers this year. The question is he going to be my Mike or is he going to be my Will? And I think he's capable of playing both roles in this Ryan Nielsen defense. And you look at the Saints, Mike was Demario Davis. You look at their Will, Pete Werner. I think Troy Anderson could mimic either one of those guys. I think if you just look at his skill set today, he's probably closer to Werner, more of that coverage type of guy, that's better in space than he is as sort of a downhill run defender. But I'm hoping with time, his skill set will be very similar to what Demario Davis's was, which is, a player that can affect the game, not only in coverage, but against the run and as a pass rusher. And so initially I was kind of like, I don't know if I want Anderson to be my Mike linebacker. And so let's go out there and get a Mike linebacker. And initially I was looking at Tremaine Edmunds and I was like prepared. I'm like, okay, Tremaine Edmunds, the Buffalo Bills middle linebacker, he's only going to turn 25 this year. He's one of the top free agents available this offseason. He's basically built like a DN, 6'5", 250, athletic, gifted in coverage, has gotten better as a run defender this past year and put together his best season overall, and I'm just like, yeah, I love me some Tremaine Edmunds, but I just get this mixed bag about, is he going to stay in Buffalo? Is he out in Buffalo? Are they going to tag him? Where is he? And then you factor in the price tag of like, PFF projecting him at $17.5 million a year. You have the Roquan Smith deal that was recently signed for $20 million a year. So maybe he wants a little bit more than that. And ultimately at the end of the day, I was like, yeah, it's a lot of money to spend on, and ultimately I kind of wanted, to keep this thing grounded a little bit in reality. And while Edmunds is very high on my wish list of my dream candidates, I wanted to be a little bit more realistic here and not go for such a big splash. And, I was thinking about it when I was really considering it. I was thinking about it from the perspective of, wouldn't it be cool if the Falcons basically spent all their free agent dollars on like non-premium positions? So in this case, linebacker, like a Tremaine Edmunds and a Jesse Bates, who are going to be their big, contracts this offseason, and then use their premium draft picks at, edge and corner as a way to sort of keep costs down, because, those are two very expensive positions. And so therefore you don't want to necessarily have to sign those guys in free agency. So that was one thought process I had, and we'll see if the Falcons, take that lead once, Terry gets out the trunk and Ryan gets out the bathroom. But ultimately, once I decide, okay, I'm not going to have Tremaine Edmunds be the pick, then I had to decide, okay, whom else am I going to get? And, I knew I had Kaden Elliss in my back pocket, but I was like, is there a better option out there? And I went through a number of options. Bobby Okereke from the Colts, very good coverage guy. Don't know if he has quite the downhill run defending ability that you want in the scheme. Drew Tranquil from the Chargers, solid player, but I don't know if he's really a plus defender in any major way in coverage against the run. Cody Barton from the Seahawks was another guy, but he kind of just feels like a poor man's Troy Anderson at this point in time. And so it boiled down to two options, and that was Ellis and David Long with the Titans. And Long probably is a really good fit. He's a really good downhill run defender. He's good enough, I think, in coverage to get by there. But there are some limitations, I think, there. And he would be a good contrast to a player like Troy Anderson. But ultimately, I went with Ellis in large part just because I feel like he'll probably be cheaper than some of these guys. Like PFF is projecting Long at $13.75 million a year. Okereke is 8.5, and Tranquil $7 million. And so I'm guessing Ellis comes in a little bit below that, maybe like $6 million, somewhere around there. And so I'm projecting like a 3-year, $20 million contract for Ellis. And ultimately, where Ellis kind of won me over was the pass rushing ability. Right. That's where he really shined this past year. Right. We talked about, Tremaine Edmunds being built like an edge rusher. But, Kaden, I was about to refer to his father, Luther, Kaden Elliss, it was an actual edge rusher when he played college football at Idaho. Right. And he was a 7th-round pick for the Saints in 2019. He hurt his knee his rookie year playing special teams, missed most of that season, came back, was primarily a special teams guy in 2020, only played 5 snaps on defense that year. But then you slowly sort of worked his way into a key depth role, was kind of a versatile backup for them, playing all 3 backup spots for them in 2021. And this past year, that versatility paid off for him because, Warner got hurt midway through the season, and there were like 5 games, I think, where he had to basically start at the wheel linebacker for the Saints next to Demario Davis. And he kind of was a revelation there. And like in that second half of the season, and then when Warner came back, they were like, oh, we're going to have to find ways to get him on the field because he just makes plays. And that was mostly as a pass rusher, right? In those final 8 games, Kaden Elliss had 6 sacks, right? And only did it on 80 rushes. I'm sorry, not 8. 80 rushes, right? Which is very impressive. Like you compare that to Rashaan Evans, who had 80 rushes the entire season. And Ellis had that in just the last 8 games, and Rashaan Evans finished with 2 sacks. And basically, you can kind of compare Kaden Elliss to what the Arizona Cardinals were hoping that Hassan Reddick would be, as an off-ball linebacker that basically has this edge rushing skill set that when you put him in the A gap or you put him in the B gap going up against some of these guards, he's going to create mismatches there. And that was kind of the final thing, because I looked again at this pass rush that I'm adding. Again, it's not sexy. But if I can get, another 4 to 6 sacks out of Kaden Elliss, that's going to do a lot to really enhance this defense and enhance this pass rush. So I'll put Kaden Elliss as my will linebacker next to Troy Anderson, who is going to be my Mike linebacker moving forward. And I think that makes sense, given the Falcons used a premium pick on Troy Anderson and took him ahead of several other linebackers that a lot of people deemed were, better, or at least had higher floors entering the NFL. And basically, if the Falcons didn't think Troy Anderson could be the quarterback of their defense and be the leader and be the sort of anchor, pivot, whatever you want to call it, at the middle of their defense, then why did they draft him so high, right? And so it's basically like, let's find out if Troy Anderson, we can develop that into that type of player, if he can be our version of Demario Davis over the next couple of years. I don't expect him to be that guy right away, but it took Demario Davis like 5 years before he became Demario Davis. So hopefully it'll take Troy Anderson, let's say 3, 2024, Troy Anderson will start to really look like Demario Davis. So I expect some growing pains, but I think overall this defense featuring these 5 additions, in addition to the returns of, a healthy Taquan Graham, Grady Jarrett, the jumps that players like Malone and, Ebiketie and Anderson are expected to make. And then not to mention probably going to draft a linebacker probably on day 3, probably hopefully take a pair of pass rushers, not only an interior guy, but an edge rusher at some point in the draft, in addition to the improvements that, I'm hoping to make in the secondary with a Jesse Bates and probably an early round corner, alongside, AJ Terrell and Isaiah Oliver and D Alford and Richie Grant and those guys. And I do feel like, again, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, that's a top 10 defense in this league. There's still building to be done, but I do really feel like we've raised the floor. We've solidified the foundation for this defense. And this is, I think it's probably realistic potentially that this defense can go from, a bottom 3, bottom 5 type of unit that they were this year to in the middle of the pack somewhere, probably, still probably below average, but if we're the 18th best defense this year, that is massive improvement for this team. And that's going to be a team that's going to be very competitive in every game that they played this year, and not just most games that they played this year. We're not going to be in a situation where, we play a team like the Bengals this year and it's like, well, this game's over, we'll feel like it's a winnable game, right? We can hold the Bengals to under 30 points or whatever. And if the offense is good enough, that's a winnable game, right? We can beat that team like 27-24 or something like that if the offense can bring it. So that's kind of my thought process with this. And, in addition to bringing in these new faces, I'm re-signing Nick Kwiatkowski, hopefully, to be a depth guy and special teams guy. And also bringing back Abdullah Anderson as well at D tackle. But I'm letting Lorenzo Carter, Rashaan Evans, Vincent Taylor, Jaleel Johnson, and Matt Dickerson all walk in free agency. And I wish them the best, but unfortunately, it won't be here in Atlanta. But that is going to do it for us here, guys, to wrap up the week with our Free Agent Friday. We'll be back on Monday with another Mock Draft Monday and probably talking about some of the combine standouts that we saw over the weekend. And that will probably be, and then we'll get the franchise tag deadline. So I'm sure in the middle of next week, we'll have a lot of things to talk about, whether, Caleb McGarry's tagged, Lamar Jackson, all that sort of stuff. So we'll have some guests next week to get you guys geared up for that. But, before we duck out of here, come check out the Discord, link in the description below, where on Saturday, we're going to do another symposium that we've consistently done every Saturday since September. And, for those of you unfamiliar, they're basically Twitter spaces. You can just show up and listen. And I've confirmed with some people that they actually listen to these things. They tend to last like 3 to 5 hours on Saturday. So they run from 3 p.m. Eastern, usually to 6 or 7. Several times we've gone to 8. Especially, last week I was trying to cut it off at 7, and then someone brought up a quarterback question and we went another hour. So it'll be fun. I think if you haven't checked it out, check it out. The link is in the Discord. But it is one of those things that, particularly this Saturday, it'll probably be going while they're doing on-field drills for the quarterbacks and receivers and all that stuff. So it should be fun to live react to the combine with that. So if you haven't checked those out, by all means, check them out. And again, if 3 p.m. doesn't work for you, we'll probably still be talking around 6 p.m. Or later or something like that. So come check it out, guys. Link in the description below. So that will do it for us here I hope you guys have a great weekend. I hope you enjoy all the great combine coverage that you won't be getting here on Locked On Falcons, but I'm sure Locked On NFL Draft with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez will have you covered all weekend long, because I know both of those guys are in Indy. So I'm sure they'll have some great content for you guys over the weekend. So continue to make them your second listen after you made Locked On Falcons your first listen. Of course, we're all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.